This is some real sad, but also incredibly interesting information. And there's definitely two big ways to look at this. One of them being the legal route and the other one being from the consumer perspective. So I'll try and give you both of them while we go throughout this video. So Dark and Darker is probably a game you've heard of at this point. It's one of those small game studio developments that comes along maybe once or twice a year and just kind of encapsulates the entire market. And people from every genre really start paying attention and think, wow, that's really cool. I can't wait to play that. We've had things like Valheim that have done the same thing. That just came out of nowhere and everybody was playing it. You couldn't go anywhere without seeing it. Things like Vampire Survivors, things like Escape from Tarkov, which is, of course, a direct parallel here, since Tarkov is the sort of origin of this genre, being an extraction hardcore shooter game. Well, Dark and Darker is an extraction hardcore but a little bit more compact game with fantasy, with basically, skeletons, swords and shields, bows and magic. Essentially, enter a dungeon. It's very dark, maybe a little bit darker, and then you kill other players, try to get loot, and then try to escape. Sell the stuff, level up your character, change your equipment, and all that good stuff. It has a lot of key elements that, transcend other genres that people really enjoy, and it's just generally a great experience, which is why it's seen such explosive growth. And it's, of course, one of the most played and requested games to release over the next couple of months, and it was in early testing, which means it was probably only going to go from strength to strength and get incredibly better. Now, the problem here is there's a lot of legal problems with Dark and Darker. Specifically, the development studio, Iron Mace, seems to have been naughty boys at some point. Now, the development here is the game has been removed from Steam. And it's been removed from Steam, as the Dark and Darker developers have confirmed, due to a DMCA takedown by Nexon regarding Dark and Darker based on, quote, distorted claims. We are currently working with our legal team to remedy this issue in the best manner possible. Due to the sensitive legal nature of this issue, we must be careful with our statements as to not jeopardize our position. We ask for your understanding as we work to get the game back up as quickly as possible. Please know that we will do all that is possible for our fans. Thanks. Now, this is not the first time in the last year or so we've seen this from another game that people were very interested in. If you remember Myth of Empires, which is a survival sandbox game, had a lot of elements from games like Conan Exiles, Ark Survival Evolve, and it's a Chinese studio called Angela Games. And what happened with Myth of Empire is exactly what we're about to go through with Dark and Darker, so it's interesting to look at what can happen and how long of a ramification this can have. So Myth of Empires was coming out and a lot of people were really excited, and then they started getting accusations from another big studio, Studio Wildcard, who, funnily enough, people from Angela Games used to work at, and they left or were fired, I can't remember the specifics, and then started their own studio and made this game. And the accusations were they stole code and potentially even assets from Studio Wildcard for games that they were working on while working for that company, which is, of course, something you're not allowed to do, and civilly, this will get you absolutely wrecked. To the point where the game was pulled from Steam over a year ago, and it's still not back on Steam, which essentially killed all hype for the game. People who had already bought it could still play, and I do believe at one point they started selling it on their own website. I'm not sure where we stand with it now, but they are still in the same legal issues, because obviously, if you worked for a company and then you leave, they were essentially alleging that they'd stolen code to work on this game, and that's clearly not allowed. Now, it's a little bit more interesting with Dark and Darker because, again, similar situation. The people who work for Iron Mace, which is a new upstart studio, all worked for Nexon. But not only did they work for Nexon, they worked on a game that was codenamed Project P3. And as you can see here from the screenshots, Dark and Darker on the right, Project P3 on the left. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to know these games look very, very similar, right? The map looks similar, the character, the controls look similar. The only difference here is the graphics look a little bit downgraded, which would be understandable considering Nexon is a massive, massive corporation, one of the biggest in gaming, and then Iron Mace is a smaller studio. Now, from what I remember without going through all the details, I do believe Project P3 was either cancelled by Nexon or it was basically pushed really far back, like they're not really focusing on it anymore. The people who were working on Project P3 at the time left the studio or were fired, similar situation to Myth of Empires, and they started Iron Mace and started working on this game. Now, according to the company profile on Iron Mace's website, it is a, quote, merry band of veteran game developers who have become disillusioned with exploitative and greedy practices and are, quote, professionals who have worked on many hits in Korea. About 25 employees are working. Now, as you can see here, the core developers of P3 are the same as the core developers of Dark and Darker. So they're working on this game, which we can all just use our common sense and look at and see. It's very, very similar. They're working on this game at Nexon, left or were fired, and then started working on their new game, Dark and Darker. Now, the allegations here are, after leaving Nexon and started working on Dark and Darker, they are suspected of leaking Nexon's assets to the outside in violation of confidentiality and security oaths during this process. In the past, they were caught trying to take key data such as game codes, resources, and development documents out of the company. Cheating at P3, those involved were disciplined by Nexon. Of course, this is a Korean article translated, so there's going to be a couple of issues. After the punishment, some developers left Nexon, and it is concluded that the new development headquarters is continuing to develop P7 by utilizing the core idea of the game. It appears that not all personnel left for Iron Mace. And of course, you might, if you've been familiar with this and been following along, remember that a couple weeks ago, some news broke that the Dark and Darker studio was raided by police, which is wild to me. It's a fairly crazy development because usually this is settled as a civil matter, right? You're basically alleging that these people stole your code, or at least stole your ideas, stole assets perhaps, and then you take them to court and it's civilly solved due to the fact that you're not allowed to do that. If you work for a company and this company is developing something and you have intimate knowledge of that thing and then you leave and start making an exact replica of that, even if you use all your own assets, all your own code, remove that from the equation, I'm fairly sure civilly you would be liable for that, at least potentially, and with a good case against you. But with police raiding the studio, they're obviously going to gather evidence there, present that back to Nexon, and then a couple weeks later getting a DMCA to the point where you're removed from Steam. That looks really bad for the future of Dark and Darker. Now, there's two ways, like I said at the beginning of the video, to look at this. The first being from Nexon's perspective, which I don't really like doing because fuck Nexon, fuck these corporations in general. But we'll get into the consumer aspect of why that's the case in a second. From their perspective, you've got people who worked for you, who were working on a project that you tasked them to do and is entirely your intellectual property, and then they leave and just remake the game, even if they don't use any of your stuff. I can see from their perspective this being like a really bad thing, and you couldn't allow this. Like, you have to protect things like that, and this would be untenable in the games industry if companies were just allowing people to do this, or if there was no repercussions for people leaving studios and just taking stuff with them, even if it's just ideas, and then making products. Now, there is, of course, a fine line between stealing and artistic inspiration, or, just taking a general idea and developing it into your own game. For instance, World of Warcraft clones in MMORPGs were never basically just carbon copy exactly the same. They were really close, but they did enough differently that you're not going to get sued for that, right? They're not, not everyone's the exact same classes, playing in the exact same world with the same characters. They're basically different enough to not have that be a problem. But in the case of if they were only slightly different and the people who were making those worked at that company, that would give you grounds to at least pursue this. Whether or not it succeeds or not depends on the jurisdiction and the finer points and details, but it would at least give you an in to take a look at things like that. Now, if it's true that Nexon had basically scrapped this project and were doing nothing with it, while I do understand still from their perspective why they would do this, because it is a breach of their trust and confidence and what an employee should be doing, it does come across to me as incredibly just bad for consumers, and pretty much everybody should, as a consumer, be against Nexon on this basis. If they were and can prove that they were still actively developing and going to release the game, it is a lot more understandable. But from the consumer perspective, I want to play Dark and Darker. I want the game to come out. I think pretty much everybody who's looking at this is going to have that same opinion. And it's always bad when things like this get stifled. Games that people want to play just don't come out for legal reasons. And this is potentially true of what's going to happen. If this goes the way Nexon wants, Dark and Darker is dead. This game doesn't come out. Because how are you going to release a game in anywhere, basically, apart from maybe you could get away with this in China, where they have very lax, let's say, copyright laws and things like that. How are you going to release this again when Nexon has more money than God, and they are going to absolutely drill you into the ground? I don't think they're going to be able to do it. So essentially, either this gets settled, whereby Iron Mace pays a whole bunch of money, if Nexon are even willing to allow that to happen, or somehow they win this case, which, based on the context of the developers working at the studio, the context of how close the game looks, like, again, you can be objective and look at this and say, there's no way you could conceive in your mind of a way that these games don't look similar enough that you can make a point. They work there, they now don't work there, and they're immediately making a game that looks this close. Nexon has a real strong point here. Being not a lawyer, I'm not going to say whether or not this is a slam dunk and this means Dark and Darker is completely dead, but based on my experience, this really looks bad for the game. And Iron Mace, of course, as a studio. But yeah, I think this is super, super interesting. It really sucks for consumers, because again, fuck Nexon, fuck corporations, especially if they're doing this just basically because they're upset that they didn't want to make the game, and then people took their idea and started making a game that people are going to really enjoy, that would undoubtedly be better than Nexon's version in terms of monetization and things like that, because Nexon, I mean, they're Nexon. We all know what to expect, especially if you've played Nexon games before. So yeah, that's Dark and Darker. I probably repeated myself a little bit in this video because I'm just trying to like work through the whole thing in my head as I go. But this is really important news, and it does suck. This is one of the games I was most looking forward to of all the games coming out that I'm aware of. Dark and Darker was one of the ones that I was really excited to play, and it's looking like maybe nobody will get to play Dark and Darker going forward. It's possible they get around this somehow. It's possible it's settled. It's possible that this amounts to nothing, but just from what I've seen and from the, common sense aspect of it, this is really bad. So there we go. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Peace out.